The air inside CECOT was a physical weight, a thing made of stale sweat and simmering hatred and the quiet hum of fluorescent lights that never went out. It settled in your lungs and stayed there, a constant reminder of the concrete world that had become your universe. Mateo knew the feeling better than his own heartbeat, which had long ago settled into the dull thud of a man waiting for nothing. He traced the crude tattoo on his forearm, the two letters that had defined his life and damned his soul, a life that now consisted of a 6-by-9-foot cell, a steel slab for a bed, and the unblinking eye of a camera in the corner. Sleep was a luxury, a temporary escape into a darkness that was only slightly less terrifying than the one he inhabited when awake, in his dreams. The girl was always there, her face a pale moon in a sea of shadow, her eyes wide with a question he could never answer. He'd killed her, a stray bullet in a street war that had meant everything and nothing. Now she was more real to him than the men he shared his tier with, more real than the stale taste of the prison-issue beans, more real than the fading memory of sunlight on his skin. Outside his cell, the symphony of CECOT played on, a chorus of clanging steel doors, distant shouts, and the soft padding of guards' boots on polished concrete, a sound that promised order but delivered only menace. He was on a tier controlled by his own, the Mara Salvatrucha. But that was a cold comfort. Loyalty in here was a currency that devalued with every passing day. Every rumor whispered through the vents, every sideways glance that held a flicker of ambition or fear. The real enemy was everyone, including the brothers who wore the same ink. His only real companion was the silence in his own head, a silence he fought to maintain against the encroaching whispers. At first, they had been faint, like wind through a crack in the wall, easily dismissed as the prison settling, or the first of the madness that chewed at the edges of every inmate's sanity. But they were growing louder, clearer, shaping themselves into words he almost understood. They seemed to ride on the currents of the recycled air, a poison breathed in and out by 4,000 condemned men, a secret shared by the very walls of their tomb. He would press his ear to the cool concrete of his cell, closing his eyes, and listen, trying to separate the sound from the frantic beating of his own heart. A heart that knew the whispers were not a product of his mind alone. The girl in his dreams was silent, but the walls spoke, and their promises were of a different kind of darkness. Ricardo watched him. Ricardo the Bull, leader of the Barrio 18 on the adjoining tier, a man whose face was a roadmap of blade work and bad intentions. He watched Mateo during meals, during the precious hour of yard time when they were allowed to see a sliver of the unforgiving Salvadoran sky, his eyes small and black and intelligent. Ricardo saw something in Mateo that worried him, a stillness, a detachment that was unnatural in a place like CECOT, where every man was a coiled spring of violence. He saw a weakness to be exploited, a crack in the armor of MS-13 that he could pry open with the right tool. The whispers had come to Ricardo too, but he heard them differently, not as a promise, but as a threat, a harbinger of a chaos that could unseat his power. He believed in blood and steel, not in shadows and murmurs, and the growing fear on the tiers was a resource to be managed, to be aimed. Officer Ramirez was young, too young for the dead look that was already setting in around his eyes, a look common to all the guards who walked these halls. Unlike the others, the brutal veterans who moved with the predatory swagger of men who enjoyed their work. Ramirez had a flicker of something else, pity perhaps, or a curiosity that bordered on the unprofessional. He sometimes let his gaze linger on Mateo for a moment too long, a small nod that was almost imperceptible, an offering of a second bread roll on Mateo's tray. These were small things, tiny breaches in the unwritten rules of this place. But in CECOT, small things grew large in the suffocating silence. Mateo didn't trust him. He trusted no one, but he watched Ramirez back, intrigued by the guard's strange and dangerous compassion. The guard was a key of some kind, Mateo felt, but he didn't yet know what lock he was meant to turn. Then the killing started, and the whispers found a voice in blood. A Barrio 18 soldier, a nobody named Hector, was found in his cell, which had been locked from the inside. His throat was not cut, but torn out, as if by an animal. A frenzy of violence that left the concrete walls painted in arterial spray. The official cause of death was inmate-on-inmate violence. A neat lie to keep the paperwork clean, but everyone knew the truth, or a version of it. No man could have done that, not with his bare hands. The door was locked. Panic, a familiar and welcome friend to men like Ricardo, began to spread. Ricardo seized the narrative, pointing the finger directly at MS-13, claiming it was a new form of internal execution, a message. His gaze in the mess hall found Mateo's, and it was filled with a chilling promise of retribution. The whispers grew louder, a sibilant chorus that celebrated the spilled blood. And in his cell that night, Mateo saw the girl's face clearly, her lips parted as if to speak, but the only sound was the murmuring of the walls, calling his name. The prison became a pressure cooker, each tear a pocket of compressed paranoia. The death of Hector was a stone dropped into a stagnant pool, and the ripples were turning into waves. Ricardo used the fear like a master sculptor, shaping it into a weapon. His lieutenants moved through the Barrio 18 population with renewed purpose, their whispers more direct than those in the walls, spreading the gospel of MS-13 treachery. They spoke of witchcraft, of unholy alliances made by their enemies to gain an edge, a narrative that found fertile ground in the minds of men who had seen too much to discount anything. Fights broke out with increasing frequency. A shiv pulled in a crowded corridor, a head smashed against a steel sink. The guards responded with their usual brutal efficiency. Tear gas and batons, solitary confinement, and cancelled privileges. But they couldn't stop the tide. They were merely zookeepers in a cage full of starving lions, and the lions were turning on each other. Mateo tried to remain an island in the storm. He kept to himself, his face a mask of indifference. But inside, a cold dread was blooming. His own people looked at him with suspicion now. Ricardo's poison had seeped through the steel bars, infecting the MS-13 ranks. They saw his quietness not as discipline, but as aloofness, his solitude as a sign of a secret alliance, or worse, madness. The whispers were his constant companions now, a council of unseen advisors. They spoke of secrets buried in the prison's foundation, of a power that predated the concrete and the steel. They told him the first death was just a taste, a promise of what was to come. At night, the face of the dead girl became entwined with the spectral voices, her silent judgment mingling with their seductive promises of escape. It was a torture more refined than anything the guards could devise. Officer Ramirez continued his strange dance of detached concern. He would appear at Mateo's cell during his rounds, his face professional but his eyes communicating something urgent. One night, he slipped a small, tightly folded piece of paper through the bars, a simple act that could have cost him his job, his life. Mateo waited until the guard was gone, his footsteps fading down the long corridor, before unfolding it. It was a crude, hand-drawn map of the prison's lower levels, a section marked with a single, stark X. Below it were 3 words. They are listening. Mateo's blood ran cold. Ramirez knew. He knew about the whispers, and the map was not a warning. It was an invitation. The confirmation that he was not going insane was a small comfort drowned by a larger fear, a fear of what Ramirez wanted from him, a fear of what waited at the X on the map. Another man died 2 nights later, this time an MS-13 shot caller. He was found in the showers, drowned in 3 inches of water, his face frozen in a mask of ultimate terror. There were no marks on him, but the guards who found him swore they heard a voice laughing in the steam-filled room long after the body was removed. The tears erupted. The fragile truce was shattered, and Ricardo had the casus belli he needed. The war was coming, and Mateo was standing directly on the fault line, with a ghost in his head and a map to hell in his hand. The whispers began to tell a story, a fractured history of the ground on which CECOT was built. It spoke of a place of ancient sacrifice, a patch of earth that had drunk blood for centuries before the first stone of the prison was ever laid. It spoke of the first warden, a man whose name was a curse, a monster who practiced rites in the dark and believed the walls themselves were his congregation, a congregation that required offerings of pain and terror to remain strong. The whispers told Mateo that the prison was not just a building, but a living entity. And it was hungry, a beast stirring from a long slumber. This knowledge was a poison and a comfort. It meant the creeping horror was real, an enemy he could potentially fight, not just a phantom of his own fractured psyche. He studied the map Ramirez had given him, memorizing every line and corridor. The X was in a section labeled Sub-Level 3, Decommissioned, an area that officially didn't exist on the modern schematics, a forgotten gut deep in the earth. His dreams became more vivid, more demanding. The little girl was no longer just a passive observer. She would point, her small hand extended towards the floor of his cell, her expression pleading. She wanted him to go down, to face whatever lurked in the prison's heart. He didn't know if she was trying to help him find salvation or lead him to his damnation. Maybe they were the same thing. The prison administration, facing a full-blown crisis with the unexplained deaths, initiated a series of lockdowns and shakedowns. They were looking for a weapon, a poison, a ghost, but they found nothing. The guards grew jumpy, their brutality sharpened by fear. They saw shadows in every corner and heard insults in every cough. Officer Ramirez became Mateo's only source of clarity in the chaos. He communicated with furtive gestures and single words during his rounds. Patience. Soon. The riot. He was planning something, orchestrating events with a subtlety that belied his youth. Mateo realized Ramirez was not just a guard. He was a player in this deadly game, a player who seemed to know all the rules. The third death was the most disturbing. A young Barrio 18 member, barely a man, was found standing in the center of the yard during a lockdown. His eyes wide open, but seeing nothing. His skin pale as ash. He was alive, but his mind was gone. He just stood there, silent and empty, until he slowly collapsed. Doctors could find no cause. It was as if his soul had been scooped out, leaving an empty shell. That night, a shared nightmare swept through the prison. Hundreds of men woke up screaming from the same dream, a dream of a tall, thin man in an old-fashioned warden's uniform, walking the tiers, his face lost in shadow, jangling a set of rusty keys, a dream from which they awoke with the phantom smell of grave dirt and decay in their nostrils. The riot exploded on a Tuesday. It started, as Ramirez had predicted, with a manufactured incident in the mess hall, a staged fight between a low-level MS-13 and a Barrio 18 thug escalated in seconds. Trays became weapons, shouts became war cries. Years of pent-up hatred erupted like a volcano, and the concrete floors were soon slick with blood. Ricardo was at the center of it, a general directing his troops, a force of nature wading through the chaos. But his eyes kept scanning the room, searching for Mateo. This wasn't just a riot. It was an assassination attempt under the cover of mass violence. Alarms blared, a deafening shriek that added to the pandemonium. Guards in full riot gear stormed the hall, firing tear gas canisters that filled the air with a choking chemical fog. The world dissolved into a cacophony of screams, guttural roars, and the sickening crack of batons on bone. Mateo moved like a phantom through the madness. His years on the street had taught him how to read violence, how to see the patterns in the chaos. He used the fighting as a screen, staying on the periphery. His goal not to engage, but to survive. To get to the rendezvous point Ramirez had specified. A small maintenance closet near the kitchen. A hulking Barrio 18 member with a skull tattooed on his face lunged at him from the smoke. A sharpened spoon clutched in his fist. A disciple sent by Ricardo to claim his head. Mateo sidestepped the clumsy thrust, his body moving with an economy of motion honed by countless such encounters. He drove his elbow into the man's temple, a short, brutal strike that sent the man crashing to the floor. He didn't wait to see the result. He just kept moving. In the screaming confusion, he saw Ramirez. The young guard was not fighting the inmates, but subtly guiding them, creating openings, channeling the flow of bodies. It was a masterful manipulation, turning the prison's own security response into a tool for his own ends. Mateo reached the closet, the air thick and hot, and slipped inside. The door was unlocked, just as Ramirez had promised. Moments later, the guard joined him. His face flushed, but his eyes calm. He barred the door from the inside, plunging them into near darkness. "Now we go down," Ramirez said, his voice barely a whisper above the din of the riot outside. He pulled away a loose metal panel on the floor, revealing a dark, narrow shaft with a rusty ladder descending into the unknown. "What is this?" Mateo asked, his voice hoarse. "It's the old way," Ramirez replied, a strange light dancing in his eyes. "The way out." As he started down the ladder, he looked back at Mateo. "I know about the girl. Mateo, the one you see in your dreams. I can make her go away." The descent was like falling into a forgotten grave. The air grew cold and damp, smelling of wet earth and something else, something metallic and sour like old blood. The sounds of the riot faded above them, replaced by a profound silence that was somehow more menacing. Water dripped from unseen pipes, each drop a tiny hammer blow in the oppressive quiet. Their only light was the thin beam of Ramirez's flashlight, a fragile blade cutting through an ocean of darkness. The ladder ended on a narrow stone landing, in front of a heavy iron door held shut by a thick, rusted bolt. Ramirez pulled a large, ornate key from his pocket, a key that looked far too old for this modern prison. "My great-grandfather was the first warden here," he said, his voice echoing strangely in the enclosed space. "People said he was a monster. They said he built a place for himself under the prison, a place where he could indulge his appetites." He slid the key into the lock. It turned with a deafening screech of protesting metal, and the door swung inward, revealing a corridor that seemed to suck the light from their torch. "The whispers told me the stories were true," Mateo stated, his gaze fixed on the abyss ahead. "The whispers tell everyone what they want to hear," Ramirez countered, stepping through the doorway. "To you, they promise freedom from guilt. To others, escape. To me, they promise truth." As they moved down the corridor, Mateo saw that the walls were not concrete, but rough-hewn stone, ancient and cold. Markings were carved into them, strange symbols and half-finished sentences in a language he didn't recognize. The whispers were stronger here, a chorus of voices just at the edge of hearing, begging, screaming, laughing. They were not alone. The sense of presence was overwhelming, a feeling of being watched by a multitude of unseen eyes. Mateo felt the ghost of the little girl stir in his mind, not with fear, but with a strange, cold anger. She was not a part of this place. She was his alone, a cross he had to bear, a separate torment from the one that saturated these stones. They found the first room, an old solitary confinement cell, much smaller and cruder than the ones upstairs. Heavy manacles were still bolted to the walls, stained dark with rust and time. A word was scratched into the floor, over and over. Odite. Listen. As Ramirez swept the light across the far wall, Mateo saw him. Ricardo, the bull, stood there, flanked by two of his most loyal killers, their faces pale and taut in the flashlight's beam. They were not smiling. Ricardo held a length of sharpened rebar in his hand, but the weapon seemed inadequate in this place, his usual blustering confidence replaced by a wary stillness. "I knew you were a rat," Ricardo hissed, his voice lacking its usual force. "Making a deal with the guards, looking for a way to crawl out. There's enough trouble here for all of us." "Ricardo," Mateo said calmly, his hand resting on a loose rock at his feet. "I don't think you belong down here." Ricardo laughed, a hollow sound that was quickly swallowed by the darkness. "This whole prison belongs to me, top to bottom." Then from the corridor behind them, a new sound emerged, a soft, rhythmic scraping, like claws on stone, moving closer, a sound that made the hairs on all their arms stand on end. The whispers fell silent, as if in reverence, holding their breath for the arrival of their master. The scraping grew louder, a dry, rasping sound that vibrated through the stone floor. It was the sound of something patient, something ancient and hungry. Ricardo's men shifted their weight, their tough guy facades cracking under the strain of a fear they couldn't name. It wasn't the threat of a rival gangster that unnerved them. It was the primordial wrongness of this place, the feeling of being intruders in a sacred and profane space. Ramirez held the flashlight steady, its beam cutting a trembling path into the darkness of the corridor. But he didn't point it at the source of the sound. He pointed it at Ricardo. "He's coming for you," Ramirez said, his voice a low monotone. "The warden, he doesn't like it when the flock fights among itself. He demands order." Ricardo spat on the floor. "I am the order here, not some ghost story." But his eyes darted nervously towards the unlit passageway, a betrayal of his bravado. A shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness, a shape that was too tall, too thin, to be a man. It moved with a disjointed grace, a puppet with tangled strings. The scraping was the sound of its long, skeletal fingers dragging against the stone wall. As it stepped into the edge of the flashlight's glow, they saw it was wearing the tattered remains of an old warden's uniform, its face a swirling vortex of shadow, featureless except for two pinpricks of cold, white light that burned like distant stars. Ricardo's two soldiers froze, their throats working, but no sound coming out, their minds unable to process what their eyes were seeing. One of them finally broke, raising his makeshift knife and screaming, a high, thin sound that was more terror than rage. He charged the figure, a suicidal act of pure instinct. The tall shadow did not move. It simply raised one of its long arms, and the man's scream cut off with a wet, snapping sound. He dropped to the floor like a sack of broken sticks, His body twisted at an impossible angle. The second soldier turned to run, scrambling back the way they had come. But the iron door to the ladder shaft slammed shut with a deafening boom, sealing them in, a sound that seemed to come from all directions at once. The whispers returned, not as a murmur, but as a triumphant roar, a choir of the damned cheering for their shepherd. The Shadow Warden took a step forward, and Ricardo's remaining man turned his knife on himself. A quick, desperate slash across his own throat, preferring a familiar death to the unknown horror before him. He collapsed in a gurgling heap, his blood pooling black on the dusty stone. Now it was just the four of them, Mateo, Ramirez, Ricardo, and the thing in the warden's uniform. "You led us into a trap." Ricardo snarled at Ramirez, his back pressed against the far wall. "This isn't a trap," Ramirez replied, a frantic, ecstatic gleam in his eyes. "It's a sacrament." The entity ignored them, its featureless face turning slowly towards Ricardo. It seemed to recognize him, to understand what he was, a source of concentrated violence and despair, a feast. Ricardo, a man who had faced down death 100 times in the barrios and prisons of his life, a man who feared nothing human, finally broke. He raised the rebar, not to attack, but as a ward against evil, a useless prayer of steel, and he began to cry. Silent tears tracking paths through the grime on his face. The entity glided towards Ricardo, its movements unnaturally smooth, devoid of the weight and friction that govern the living. Ricardo pushed himself off the wall and lunged, a final desperate act of defiance. He swung the rebar in a wild arc, an attack that should have crushed a human skull, but the iron bar passed through the warden's shadowy head as if through smoke. There was no impact, no resistance. The warden's arm snapped out, its long fingers uncurling. It did not grab or strike Ricardo. It simply touched his forehead with the tip of one skeletal finger. Ricardo screamed, a sound unlike any Mateo had ever heard. It was the sound of a soul being peeled away from the flesh. Layer by agonizing layer, he convulsed violently, his eyes rolling back into his head. A froth of blood and saliva bubbling from his lips, he clawed at his own face, tearing at his skin, at his eyes, as if trying to rip out the horror that had been poured directly into his brain. He dropped the rebar with a clang and collapsed, twitching on the stone floor before falling still. The bull was dead, his formidable power extinguished by a single touch. The Shadow Warden turned its empty gaze from the corpse towards Mateo and Ramirez. It seemed to study them for a long moment. Then it receded back into the darkness from which it came, its presence lingering like a foul odor. Ramirez let out a long, shaky breath, a sound that was half relief and half disappointment. "He's testing us," the guard whispered, his voice trembling. "Judging us. The price of passage is high." "Passage to where?" Mateo asked, his own voice barely audible. He knelt by Ricardo's body. There were no marks on him, but his face was locked in an expression of such absolute terror that it seemed impossible. It was the face of a man who had stared into the abyss and found the abyss staring back. "The sanctum," Ramirez said, reloading his flashlight and pushing forward. "Deeper into the labyrinth. My great-grandfather's private chapel. It's down here. All the answers are down here." They moved through a maze of twisting corridors and decaying rooms, each one more disturbing than the last. They found a laboratory filled with crude surgical tools and jars containing things that were once human. They found a room where the walls were covered in frantic, clawed-out prayers to forgotten gods. The whispers followed them, narrating the atrocities that had occurred in each space. telling the stories of the souls that were permanently stained into the architecture. Mateo felt a strange duality. He was terrified, a cold knot of fear tighter than any he had known on the streets. But he was also calm, focused, in this place of pure evil. His own sins felt smaller. The ghost of the little girl was quiet in his mind, a silent passenger on this journey through hell. Perhaps she had brought him here for this reason, to show him a darkness so profound it made his own transgressions look pale by comparison. Or perhaps he was just the next sacrifice. They reached another door, this one made of heavy, dark wood, reinforced with iron straps. The air here was freezing cold, and a low humming sound emanated from within, a sound that resonated deep in Mateo's bones. "We're here," Ramirez said, his hand resting on the door's large iron ring. He built the prison on top of this. This was the source, the reason for it all. And he found a way to control it. He looked at Mateo, his eyes wild. He wrote it all down in his journal. How to make the offering, how to command the shadows. "What offering?" Mateo asked, though he already suspected the answer. Ramirez gave him a thin, predatory smile. "It requires a sinner, Mateo, a man of great violence with a heavy soul. The warden requires a sacrifice to open the final door." He raised his flashlight, not as a tool for illumination, but as a club. Ricardo was the appetizer. You were the main course. The betrayal was so pure, so expected in a world like this, that it barely registered as a shock. Mateo felt a cold sense of inevitability settle over him. Of course, the compassionate guard was just another monster wearing a different kind of mask. Ramirez lunged, swinging the heavy flashlight at Mateo's head. He was faster than he looked, energized by his fanatical purpose. Mateo reacted on instinct, ducking under the clumsy swing and driving his shoulder into Ramirez's chest. They crashed against the cold stone wall, a tangle of limbs in the semi-darkness. The flashlight flew from Ramirez's grasp, skittering across the floor and casting wild, dancing shadows before coming to rest in a corner, its beam pointing at the ceiling, leaving them in a twilight gloom. My family was ruined. Ramirez grunted, trying to force his forearm against Mateo's throat. Shunned, because of what my great-grandfather did here. They said he was insane, a butcher, but they were wrong. He was a pioneer, a visionary. He was surprisingly strong, his wiry frame powered by a zealot's conviction. There is no truth here, no salvation. Mateo gasped, shoving Ramirez back. Only death, the walls told me. The walls lie to the unworthy. Ramirez screamed, his voice cracking. He pulled a standard-issue prison shiv from his boot, its polished metal catching the faint light. But the journal never lies. There's a treasure down here, not gold or jewels, but power, real power. And the warden demands a soul to guard his gate. Your soul, convict. He came at Mateo again, the shiv held in a reverse grip, slashing and jabbing with trained precision. Mateo gave ground, moving back into the center of the chamber, using the space to evade the frantic attacks. He had no weapon, only his hands and his wits. Years of prison yard brawls had taught him to be a survivor. But Ramirez was driven by something more than a will to live. He was driven by a holy madness. "What do you get out of this?" Mateo asked, circling his opponent, buying time, trying to understand the depths of the guard's delusion. "Redemption," Ramirez spat. "I will reclaim my family's name. I will finish his work. I will become the new warden." From the corner of his eye, Mateo saw it. The corpse of Ricardo, the rebar still lying where he had dropped it. It was a risk, turning his back for even a second. But it was his only chance, as Ramirez lunged again, aiming for his gut. Mateo feinted to the side, then pivoted and dived towards the floor, his fingers wrapping around the cold, heavy steel of the bar. He rolled back to his feet just as Ramirez was upon him. He swung the rebar in a short, powerful arc, not aiming to kill, but to disarm. The steel bar connected with Ramirez's wrist with a sickening crack. The shiv clattered to the floor. Ramirez howled in pain, cradling his broken arm, his face a mask of shock and fury. "You are not worthy to be a sacrifice," he shrieked, his sanity completely unraveling. "The filth of the street is all you will ever be." Before Mateo could respond, the great wooden door to the sanctum swung open on its own. It didn't creak, it moved with an unnerving silence. A profound darkness lay beyond it, a void that seemed to have its own gravity, pulling the light and the air and all hope into it. The low humming intensified, becoming a deep, vibrational drone that shook the very foundations of the prison. Ramirez stared at the open doorway, his pain forgotten, a look of awe and terror on his face. "He invites us," he whispered. The room beyond the door was not a chapel. It was a pit. The floor sloped downwards towards the center, where a pool of absolute blackness churned slowly. It wasn't water. It was a living shadow, a liquid nothingness that pulsed with a slow, malevolent heartbeat. The walls were covered in a lattice of human bones, skulls, femurs, and ribs arranged in intricate, blasphemous patterns. The air was colder than a mortuary slab, a dead cold that clung to the skin, and standing at the edge of the pit was the tall, thin figure of the warden. He was more solid here, less like smoke, and more like something carved from petrified night. The 2 points of light in his shadowy face burned with an ancient intelligence. An intelligence that had witnessed the birth of stars and the death of civilizations. He was not a ghost, not a mere echo of a dead man. He was something far older, something that had been summoned or woken by the warden and imprisoned in this foundation of suffering. CECOT was not its prison. CECOT was its temple. Ramirez staggered into the room, his broken arm held tight to his chest, a beatific smile on his pain-contorted face. "Master," he breathed, his voice filled with religious fervor, "I have brought the offering, a violent soul, steeped in sin, just as the journal commands." He shoved Mateo forward, towards the pit, towards the waiting entity. Mateo stumbled, catching his balance just feet from the churning darkness. He could feel its pull, a siren song promising oblivion, an end to the guilt and the memories and the endless waking nightmare. It would be so easy to let go, to simply fall and be unmade. The entity turned its head slightly, a gesture of consideration. It looked from the kneeling, worshipping Ramirez, to the defiant, breathing Mateo. The whispers rose to a fever pitch inside Mateo's head, 1,000 voices all screaming for him to jump, to complete the ritual, to feed the ancient hunger. And then, through the cacophony, came a different voice, a whisper of his own. The little girl. Her image bloomed in his mind's eye, clearer than ever before. She was not pointing to the floor anymore. She was looking at him, and for the first time, she spoke, not with words, but with a feeling, a wave of pure, unadulterated sorrow and forgiveness that washed over him, cutting through the entity's psychic assault. She wasn't a curse. She wasn't a part of this prison's evil. She was just a lost soul, tethered to him by a thread of shared tragedy. And in that moment, she was offering him not damnation, but absolution. He understood then. The entity fed on guilt, on despair, on hatred. It had no power over a soul that had been forgiven. even if that forgiveness came from the victim of his own crime. He turned his back on the pit and faced Ramirez. "She forgives me," Mateo said, his voice clear and strong. Ramirez looked at him, his expression twisting from rapture to confusion to rage. "What? No, that's not how it works. You must pay. The sinner must be punished. I've already been punished," Mateo said. "Every day of my life, I have lived in this prison, and the one outside it. It ends now." The warden entity seemed to loom larger, sensing the change, sensing its meals slipping away. Its shadowy form wavered, a low growl of frustration emanating from the pit. It had been cheated. Ramirez shrieked in frustration and lunged at Mateo, his good hand clawing for his face, a desperate attempt to force him into the pit and complete the ritual. "He chose you, you ungrateful bastard!" Mateo caught the guard's wrist, his grip like iron, and held the smaller man easily. Ramirez was nothing without his fanaticism, just a broken boy playing with shadows far too vast for him to comprehend. "He didn't choose me," Mateo said, looking past Ramirez to the entity. "He just found me, a hungry animal smelling blood in the water. But you invited him in." He looked deep into Ramirez's eyes and saw the terrible truth. Ramirez was not just a worshiper. He was a vessel. The madness that fueled him wasn't his own. It was an infection planted by the entity, a seed that had grown in the fertile soil of his family's shame and his own greed. "You think there is a treasure?" Mateo asked. "You think there is power? Look." He gestured with his head towards the pit. "That is the treasure, an eternity of being a slave to that thing, a gatekeeper for a prison within a prison." The entity's low growl deepened. It took a step towards them, the very stones trembling with its anger. Its shadowy arm began to stretch, to elongate, the fingers sharpening into claws of solidified darkness. It was done waiting, done playing games. It was going to take what it wanted by force. And then Mateo's ghost, the spirit of the small girl, appeared beside him, not just in his head, but in the room. She was a faint, shimmering outline of light in the crushing darkness, a figure of impossible innocence in this chamber of ultimate corruption. She did not look at the warden or at Mateo. Instead, she turned and pointed at the wall to their left, a section of bone-covered stone that looked no different from the rest. But Mateo knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that this was the way. This was her final gift to him. Freedom, a way out that wasn't about escape, but about redemption. "No," Ramirez whispered, his eyes wide with horror as he saw the shimmering girl, a thing of light that had no place in his master's sanctum. He seemed to finally understand how utterly he had failed, how he had brought a holy relic into a den of thieves. He let go of Mateo and scrambled on his hands and knees towards the entity. "Forgive me, Master. I will make it right. I will serve you. Take me instead." The entity looked down at the groveling form of Ramirez, and for a moment, the 2 points of light in its face seemed to brighten with something akin to satisfaction. It had been promised a soul, and a soul it would have. The Shadow Warden's arm shot out and wrapped around Ramirez, not with violence, but with an embrace. It pulled the weeping guard into its own formless body, and Ramirez's screams were muffled as he was absorbed into the darkness, his body dissolving like sugar in water until nothing was left but the faint echo of his terror. Mateo didn't wait to watch the gruesome consummation. He turned and ran to the spot on the wall the girl had indicated. The bones were cold and brittle beneath his fingers. He pulled at them, tore at them, heedless of the sharp edges that cut into his hands. Behind him, he could hear a sound of immense satisfaction, a deep psychic sigh as the entity digested its meal. The whispers had stopped. The great hunger was temporarily sated. Behind the lattice of bones, he found not stone, but decaying mortar and crumbling brick, an older wall that had been sealed up. Using the rebar he still clutched in his hand, he began to hammer at it. Each blow was a prayer, each strike a blow against his past, against the man he had been. The mortar gave way in clouds of acrid dust, and soon he had created a small opening. A draft of cool, damp air washed over his face, smelling not of blood and decay, but of mud and rain. It was the smell of the world outside. He widened the hole frantically, his muscles screaming in protest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The entity behind him was stirring again, its momentary peace disturbed by the sound of this desecration, this impossible escape from its tomb. He could feel its cold attention focus on him again, a psychic pressure building at the base of his skull. He risked a glance over his shoulder. The shadow of Ramirez was gone, absorbed completely, and the entity was gliding towards him, its form larger now, darker, fueled by its recent meal. It was no longer waiting, no longer testing. It was coming to collect him, to drag him back into its pit and silence him forever. He gave one final, desperate heave, and a large section of the brick wall collapsed, revealing a narrow, dark tunnel beyond. He didn't hesitate. He scrambled through the opening, cutting himself on the sharp edges of the broken bricks, and began to crawl into the darkness on his hands and knees, a darkness that felt different from the one in the sanctum, a natural darkness, a darkness that promised an end, a darkness he welcomed. Behind him, he heard a roar of pure, frustrated rage that was not a sound, but a wave of force, a psychic blast that threatened to tear his mind apart. The entire chamber shook, and the tunnel he was in began to crumble. He crawled faster, dirt and rocks raining down on his back, propelled by sheer terror and a desperate, burgeoning hope. He crawled until his knees and hands were raw, until his lungs burned, following the current of fresh air, the promise of a world he thought he would never see again. The tunnel was a forgotten storm drain, a relic of an older city that CECOT had been built upon, a vein of freedom buried beneath a mountain of despair. The ghost of the girl was gone, her duty done. He was alone now, truly alone for the first time in years, crawling from the belly of the beast into the uncertain light. He crawled for what felt like an eternity. The narrow pipe, his entire world. The sounds of the collapsing prison far behind him. The air grew fresher, the smell of rain stronger, until finally he saw it. A faint gray light ahead. Hope. A feeling so alien he barely recognized it. Surged through him, giving him a final burst of strength. He pushed forward, his body screaming in protest, and emerged from the end of the pipe, tumbling out onto a muddy embankment under a torrent of rain. The storm was a cleansing thing, washing the filth and the blood and the stench of the prison from his skin. He lay there for a long time, his face turned up to the sky, letting the cold water baptize him, bring him back to life. He was free. The word was a foreign country. He stood up on Shoisio on shaky legs. His prison uniform was torn and filthy. His body was a tapestry of cuts and bruises, but he was alive. He was breathing free air. In the distance, he could see it. The monstrous silhouette of CECOT, a concrete behemoth hunched against the stormy sky, a tomb pretending to be a prison. The lights on its perimeter walls seemed to mock the darkness, a futile attempt to contain the absolute evil that festered within its heart. He wondered about the other men, the thousands left behind. Were the whispers silent now, or was the entity in the pit just biding its time, waiting for its hunger to return, waiting for the next sinner to listen to its promises. He knew the answer. The prison was a wound on the face of the earth, and the thing he had met was the infection, a cancer that could not be cured. He had not escaped. No one ever truly escaped a place like that. He had merely been released, a single cell deemed unworthy of the disease. He thought of Ramirez, the boy who had wanted to be a warden and had become a sacrament. He thought of Ricardo, the bull who had ruled a world of violence only to be undone by a violence he couldn't comprehend. They were both part of the prison now, their stories and their souls mortared into its accursed walls. He felt no pity for them, only a vast, empty weariness. He turned his back on the prison, on the life that had been his, and started to walk. He had no destination, no plan, no identity other than that of a survivor. The tattoos on his arms now felt like scars from a different man's life. He would be hunted, by his old gang for his perceived desertion, by the law for his escape, by his own memories for the crimes he had committed. But for the first time in more than a decade, the path he walked was his own. The whispers were gone. The little girl's sad face had faded from his mind, replaced by the sound of the rain and the rhythmic beat of his own heart. He vanished into the rain-soaked darkness of the Salvadoran night, a ghost who had walked out of hell and back into the uncertain world of the living, a man forever haunted not by the dead, but by the terrible, unshakable knowledge of what lurked just beneath the surface of the world, waiting patiently for the next lost soul to listen. The rain plastered what remained of his prison fatigues to his skin, but he barely felt the cold. A fire had been lit inside him, a low, steady burn of pure survival, a flame he thought had been extinguished years ago in the suffocating routine of prison life. Each step took him further from CECOT, but its shadow stretched long, even in the pre-dawn gloom, a psychic anchor he would drag behind him for the rest of his days. He walked until the storm subsided and the first gray fingers of dawn began to probe the eastern sky. He found himself on the outskirts of a small, sleeping town, a place of humble cinder-block homes and stray dogs that watched him pass with weary indifference. He was a ghost here, an apparition from a world these people prayed they would never know. Hunger began to gnaw at his stomach, a basic, animal need that grounded him in his new reality. He broke into a small panaderia, the snap of the cheap lock, an echo of a life he had sworn to leave behind. He moved with the quiet efficiency of his past, taking only what he needed: a few loaves of bread, a bottle of water, a clean shirt from a line behind the building. As he ate the bread, its simple taste was a revelation, a communion with a life of simple things he had long forgotten. He ate slowly, mechanically, as he watched the town begin to wake. A man started a sputtering truck. A woman swept her doorstep. Children in school uniforms walked down the dirt road, laughing, a sound so alien and beautiful it almost brought him to his knees. This was the world he had forfeited, the world he had helped to terrorize. And now he was a silent observer, a phantom at the feast. He knew he couldn't stay. His face, even without a name, was the face of CECOT, the face of the gangs that were a cancer on this nation. Someone would recognize the tattoos, or the haunted look in his eyes, the look of a man who had seen the gears of the world turning behind the curtain of reality. He needed to disappear, to erase the man named Mateo and become someone else, something else. He found a small river on the edge of the town and washed himself in the cold, clear water. He scrubbed at his skin until it was raw, trying to remove the feel of the prison, the touch of the shadows, a futile, symbolic cleansing. He looked at his reflection in the water. A gaunt, feral stranger stared back at him. the lines of his face carved by cruelty and fear. But the eyes were different. The dull, defeated emptiness was gone, replaced by a hard, focused clarity. He had been judged in the lowest circle of hell, not by a demon or a god, but by the ghost of a child, and had been found worthy of a second chance. He would not waste it. He took a sharp piece of rock and began the slow, agonizing process of scraping the MS-13 tattoos from his skin. A self-inflicted penance paid in blood and pain under the indifferent gaze of the rising sun. Every searing kit was an apology to the girl, every drop of his own blood a prayer for the one he had spilled. He journeyed for days, staying off the main roads, sleeping in abandoned shacks in dense forests, moving only at night. He was a creature of the shadows now, by choice rather than by confinement. The world of men was a dangerous place, loud and bright and filled with reminders of what he had lost, what he had destroyed. The skills that had made him a formidable enforcer on the street now kept him alive in the wilderness. He could read the landscape, find food and water, move without a sound. He was a hunter again. But his prey was now anonymity. His trophy was another day of freedom. One evening, huddled by a small, smokeless fire in a deep ravine, he realized he was being followed. It wasn't the police. Their movements were loud and clumsy. It wasn't his former gang. Their approach would have been direct and violent. This was something else, something patient and quiet, as skilled in the art of stealth as he was. For 2 days he played a careful game of cat and mouse, leaving false trails, doubling back on his tracks, trying to get a look at his pursuer. Finally, on the 3rd night, he succeeded. He laid a trap, a simple snare that would make a sound, and waited, hidden in the dense undergrowth. An hour after moonrise, he heard the soft snap of a twig. He saw a figure move through the moonlight, small and wiry, moving with an unnerving confidence. It was not a man. It was a woman. She was old, her face a mask of wrinkles, her eyes dark and knowing. She wore the simple clothes of a rural campesina, but she held herself with an authority that seemed ancient. She stopped and looked directly at his hiding place, as if she could see him perfectly in the dark. "I know you are there, Ghost of CECOT," she said, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "I have been waiting for you." Mateo slowly rose from his concealment, his hand gripping the sharpened stick that served as his only weapon. He said nothing. "You carry the stench of that place on you," she continued, her gaze unwavering. "The stench of the stone and the old hunger. I have seen it before, in my father, and his father before him. We are the keepers of the stories, the ones who remember what the earth should not be made to hold. Who are you?" Mateo finally asked, his voice rough from disuse. "My family lived on that land for generations, before the prison was a thought in a madman's mind," she said. "We knew what slept beneath the soil, a sickness from the old times, a hungry spirit. My great-grandfather warned the builders. He told them they were constructing a monument on the lid of hell. They called him a superstitious fool and threw him off his own land." She took a step closer, her eyes boring into him. But a piece of the story was lost, a prophecy that one day the pit would demand a new keeper, and a prisoner would walk free to carry the warning. "You are the messenger, Mateo. You have looked into its face and survived." He shook his head. "I'm no messenger. I'm just a man trying to outrun his past." The old woman smiled, a sad, knowing expression. "You can never outrun that kind of darkness. It has marked you, it has seen you, and it will not forget. You do not carry a message of words. You carry it in your soul, a warning to all who would seek power in the dark places of the world. Now you have a choice. You can keep running until you're past, or the prison's long shadow finally catches you. Or you can learn to wear the mark. Learn to fight the darkness that is not just in prisons, but in the hearts of all men. She offered him a place at her fire, a chance to rest, a chance to listen. For the first time since he had climbed out of that pit, Mateo did not feel alone. He sat, and the old woman began to tell him the stories, the true stories, of the warden, the entity, and the endless war between the light and the profound, unending darkness, a war he now knew was terrifyingly real, and that he was, for better or worse. Now a soldier in, his escape was not the end of his story. It was the beginning.